Throughout March and April, rallies against anti-Asian hate occurred throughout California cities such as San Francisco, Walnut Creek, San Jose, and Sacramento. Although hashtag Stop Asian Hate and recent campaigns against anti-Asian sentiment can be traced to the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the issue catapulted into national headlines with the death of Visha Vatanabhakti. Subsequent attacks in San Francisco, Oakland, and New York brought further attention to this issue, which led to widespread condemnation from activists, politicians, athletes, and celebrities. While I'm happy that the issue is being discussed, subordinating crime and public safety under the banner of anti-racism presents several issues. Firstly, it has all the trappings of how we discuss race, including its mystification and disconnection from political economy. Secondly, by framing the issue as racism, it suggests that anti-racism or anti-racist policies are appropriate remedies. Before we jump into the heart of the matter, I want to discuss how members of the Asian community, particularly those on social media and other online spaces, are responding to hashtag Stop Asian Hate and crimes impacting Asians. I'm noticing 2 or 3 distinct reactions to the recent surges in anti-Asian violence and crime. The first one is your classic law and order reaction. People in this camp advocate for a punitive response to the uptick in anti-Asian violence. They want tough on crime measures like longer sentences, aggressive prosecution, and broken windows policing. It's understandable that people want a robust and effective criminal justice system that can effectively neutralize offenders who have done harm to our friends, family, or members of the community. While I'm horrified and sickened by the attacks inflicted on Asians and innocent victims in general, I do not believe we should expand police powers or increase the incarceration of our fellow citizens. The second response comes from individuals who are bewildered and frustrated at the lack of public support from other minority groups. There are Asians who feel that their support for causes like Black Lives Matter or immigration reform warrants reciprocation from other minorities. A common feeling expressed by this cohort will mention Black Lives Matter or George Floyd. We stood for Black lives and we stood against police violence. Now please stand with us against anti-Asian hate. An offshoot of the second group will react to anti-Asian crimes by immediately calling for Asian and Black unity or calls to examine internalized anti-Blackness. They might post historical articles or old photos of Asian Americans protesting with Black Americans, usually from the Civil Rights era, in a plea for interracial solidarity. I can understand why some activists are doing this. Some of the most high-profile attacks on Asians involved a Black suspect. People are rightfully worried that this could lead to prejudice and generalizations of Black Americans, racism, and stereotyping. Now, the core principles that characterize the last 2 reactions are anti-racism and identity as the basis of organization. There is an assumption that all minorities suffer or have suffered from racism and have an interest in fighting it. According to that belief, minorities can or will naturally come together for some sort of political project. This is why Asian activists are frustrated over the lack of public support from other minority groups. Additionally, Asian activists assume that simply pointing out past historical instances of interracial unity will somehow generate the alliances and coalitions needed to extract concessions. This is a totally wrong-headed way of thinking about things. It's certainly true that minorities have suffered racism, prejudice, and discrimination. I've yet to meet an Asian American who has not experienced a racist incident. Nevertheless, constituency based on race makes class invisible within social groups. Per historian Toure Reed, in the context of Black politics, one can make the argument that it leaned progressive from the 1940s to the 1970s, but certainly not afterward. Blacks and other minorities were able to join the ranks of the middle class and enter politics, shifting their material and class interests. I'm certain the same class dynamics affect Asians as well, albeit anecdotally. It's rather silly to assume that by virtue of having the same skin color, or perhaps the same cultural background, political differences over how to tackle racism, inequality, and social ills will simply vanish. We all have that conservative uncle or parent that is well off financially, that preaches hard work, the sanctity of free markets, low taxes, and tough on crime measures. The fact remains that there are Asian conservatives and Republicans. not because they're race traitors, but because it's in their best interest to believe such things. In a similar vein, calls for interracial unity based off pictures and articles written during the civil rights era come off as juvenile. These photos and documents may have an emotive quality, but we often view them through a decontextualized lens without a proper understanding and appreciation of the material realities captured. I'm no historian of the civil rights era, but the oppositional forces of that age were more robust, with a myriad of organizations and organizers with links to communities and real constituents. Rather than being against a generic racism, people fought for tangible policies like voting rights, anti discrimination laws, for jobs and wages. This is why political scientist Adolph Reed calls the civil rights movement the last real movement in the United States. The usage of civil rights/black power aesthetics and thinking erroneously assumes we can combat current social realities with strategies from a much different time. Contemporary activists would do well to understand the current political landscape and how it differs from the 1960s. The American left is weak, it's fragmented and crippled by identity politics. The labor movement, the traditional channel for left-wing struggles, is on the defensive. People are demoralized, tired, and disillusioned from decades of declining standards of living, inequality, inept politicians, and so forth. Activists, no matter how well-intentioned, who post past or even current examples of interracial unity, are attempting to conjure a political movement by shortcut, skipping the necessary step of talking and building deep relationships with ordinary people. Now you might say, well, it doesn't matter if they're middle class, working class, liberal, Republican, etc. Everyone is affected by racism and should be interested in fighting it. My conservative Asian uncle and my liberal Asian friend would totally be down for #StopAsianHate. Yet the limits of contemporary political discourse and agendas of governing/corporate elites produce ideas that are unlikely to attack the heart of the matter. The irony of #StopAsianHate is it actually blocks us from identifying the root issues of crime and how we combat it. As I elaborate further on, #StopAsianHate turns crime, an issue governed by economic and social policy, into an issue of racism. This is not to say that racism is out of the equation or that it doesn't exist, but if activists believe racism to be the problem, then anti-racism must be the solution. To many, this means diversity, representation, supporting Asian business, and amplifying Asian voices. I believe those that espouse such policies are good-hearted and well-intentioned people. However, these policies do not tackle the roots of the public safety problem experienced not only by Asians, but by poor and marginalized people everywhere. As I alluded to in the beginning, the attacks on Asian Americans are being framed as anti-Asian hate, racism, and the work of white supremacy. While I do not doubt that hate and prejudice played a part in these attacks, anti-racism is not a useful framework nor a solution to matters of public safety. Mai Abe, a TikToker with over 66,000 followers, created a viral TikTok video urging Black and Asian unity, stating that tensions between Blacks and Asians are a, quote, direct result of the shadow of white supremacy that we all live under that continues to pit minority groups against each other for some semblance of power and a slight edge over each other, end quote. And, quote, we forget to come together to fight the real issue, white supremacy, end quote. Kim Saira, an Instagrammer with over 80,000 followers, made an IG post containing slides that read, quote, white supremacy controls almost every resource plus access point, resulting in violence towards POC, plus the pressure felt by POC towards each other. This leads to lateral oppression plus hate crimes against POC. When white people acknowledge that they feed into plus benefit from the system of white supremacy plus actively work to dismantle it, it provides a more equitable space, end quote. Michelle Kim, CEO of an organization that provides diversity and inclusion workshops, lamented on Instagram stating, quote, today, white supremacy is in action again, pitting our communities against each other and banking on our collective amnesia about the conditions that have birthed the violence, end quote. She criticizes the failure of the government to provide financial security, general inequality, and racism within our medical system, items that can be attributed more to capitalism than white supremacy. She then unloads a volley of head scratching statements intended to be solutions to anti Asian crime that manage to condense black people and Asian people while simultaneously claiming that Asians are not a monolithic group. Quote, as Asians, we must interrogate the conditions and narratives we find ourselves in and remember in our core that white supremacy is not our savior. We have an opportunity to reclaim our narratives and our identity by being loud, angry, political, defiant, and in lockstep with the black community to keep our community safe while denouncing systems that have never protected us. End quote. If Asians are not a monolithic group, then there wouldn't be something called our narrative or our identity, because it doesn't exist. Moreover, her belief that Asians and blacks are organic communities and simply victims of white supremacy misses the class realities of both groups. The fact is, there are blacks and Asians who reside on one end of the class spectrum who are ready to soldier on for the neoliberal regime's war on working people. Barack Obama, Kamala Harris, Bobby Jindal, Nikki Haley, Michelle Steele, Young Kim are just some examples. Centering white supremacy/racism as the drivers of anti-Asian crimes produces severely lackluster answers. If you listen to some of my episodes, I've railed against the idea that entrepreneurship and supporting businesses are appropriate ways to tackle racism and police violence. Last year, we heard about supporting black businesses. This year, it's support Asian businesses. Historian Toure Reed calls this intraracial trickle-down, the notion that minorities will do right onto each other by virtue of being people of color. If this were the case, there would have been no need for labor unions or calls for raising the minimum wage, since white employers would be paying living wages to their workers. Liberals and progressives have lambasted trickle-down economics, the belief that cutting taxes for the rich and giving generous incentives to big business would stimulate gains for everyone at the bottom. And rightly so, it doesn't work. So why do we think it will work for people of color? Minorities are affected by the same capitalist forces that affect white people. Business owners, regardless of their background, skin color, sex, or gender, still need to make a profit, and it usually comes at the expense of higher salaries for their workers. Even in a hypothetical situation where business owners support the marginalized, wouldn't it make more sense to give directly to those who are most affected? Now, this isn't a knock on people who want to support their favorite business. My father owns a small business, and I would be delighted if he had more customers. This is a knock on the idea that buying stuff is some sort of revolutionary act, plus the idea that all Asians look after each other, or all blacks look after each other, or all gays look after each other. We scoff at the notion that buying a handbag or a t-shirt with a rainbow flag will help LGBTQ people. So why do we think that buying from an Asian-owned business will translate to gains for the most poor and marginalized? Considering that most people work for a company rather than owning one, supporting Asian-run businesses benefits only a small population. And if most offenders come from the bottom rung of the class ladder, how does supporting a business actually provide help? To think that minorities lie somewhere outside the realm of capitalist relations is a truly stunning mental feat that I wish people would stop doing. Another solution liberals and activists propose is increased Asian representation in various industries and positions of leadership. During the last several months, there were articles criticizing the bamboo ceiling in the tech industry and the lack of Asian leads in Hollywood. There's nothing particularly wrong with these ideas. Diversity is a good thing. Interacting with people of different backgrounds can have a positive effect of smashing stereotypes. Yet, like supporting Asian-run businesses, this doesn't get to the heart of crime and its causes. The irony of the "need more Asians in XYZ" argument is it actually doesn't help all Asians. According to Pew Research Center, Asians have the highest levels of income inequality compared to any other racial group in the United States. Asians at the top 10% of the income distribution made 10.7 times as much than Asians in the bottom 10%, higher than African Americans, whites, and Hispanics. The point is that politics of diversity and anti-racism is a class politics where those residing in the upper echelons and those in the professional managerial stratum will gain the most from. Future software engineers, tech executives, Hollywood stars, prospective managers, academics, and those in the diversity industry are just some of those poised to benefit. This is a point lost to many Asian American activists. Pleas for more diversity and representation are not challenges to capitalist class society. On the contrary, they reinforce our highly stratified society by demanding equal access to each rung of the class ladder. No one ever asked for diversity in the automotive repair field. No one asked for more Asian American Amazon warehouse workers. No one asked for more Asian grocery store clerks. And if activists did ask for these, we would have to challenge the notion of class society itself, inequality, and poverty. In other words, politics of anti-racism distract us from talking about economic and social policies that have a real impact on people's lives and crime. From a practical standpoint, denouncing the attacks as anti-Asian hate is a big head scratcher for me. Activists will point to the myriad of incidents that involved racism and prejudice, ranging from what happened to Jeremy Lin, COVID-19 related xenophobia, workplace harassment, and so on, as proof that racism exists. Now, there's no denial that racism and prejudice affect Asians, and racism may certainly be a motivating factor in these crimes. Nonetheless, how does denouncing racism or identifying these crimes as racially motivated provide actual real safety? I can probably guess the answer. Someone will say humanization of Asians or the challenging of negative stereotypes leads to a healthier view of Asian Americans. Asian Americans are worthy of dignity and respect. Asian Americans are humans too. This is all true, but who is the intended audience for these kinds of statements or practices? I highly doubt a person who intends to commit a crime is concerned about racial or social justice at the time of the incident. They probably have more pressing matters like physical safety, shelter, money, mental health, or substance abuse issues. Lumping crime into the umbrella of racism not only denies the myriad of reasons that motivate people to do what they do, but leaves us in an awkward place. Activists are able to avoid the conservative trope of personal responsibility by blaming white supremacy as the cause of recent anti-Asian crimes. This suggests that crimes against minorities can be attributed to a lack of education and understanding and can be rectified through diversity or implicit bias training. There is research that suggests these trainings do not work and actually reinforce biases and stereotypes against minorities, but admittedly, I've not looked into them. More importantly, the emphasis on HR training draws us away from discussions on systemic failure and plays into technocratic liberal assumptions that education and credentials can resolve all social problems. Although white supremacy may initially look like a plausible explanation for the issues that blacks, Asians, and other minority groups experience, it is, at best, a shorthand. A deeper look into issues like police violence, public safety, and inequality reveal that the framework of white supremacy with anti-racism as the cure is inadequate for tackling the problems we face. An example of this is the racial wealth gap. The racial wealth gap between blacks and whites is seen as proof of racism and white supremacy. But as Matt Brunig from People's Policy Project notes, when wealth per racial group is broken down into deciles, nearly all black wealth is owned by the top 10% of black households, and nearly all white wealth is owned by the top 10% of white households. Even if you close the racial wealth gap between the bottom 90% of white households and the bottom 90% of black households, the overall wealth gap would only fall 22.5%. This means that the top 10% of both groups drive 77.5%, or over 3/4 of the overall racial wealth gap. If you close the wealth gap between the bottom 50% of white families and black families, it would shave off a mere 3% of the overall racial wealth gap. Now, while it's regrettable that rich blacks do not have as much wealth as their rich white counterparts, it should be concerning to anyone that considers themselves a leftist or a champion of equality that the bottom 80 to 90% of blacks and whites own little if no wealth at all. Anti-racist calls for rectifying the racial wealth gap will certainly benefit the upper crust of both racial groups, but will do very little for the majority of blacks and whites. Per Professor of Sociology Robert Manduka, quote, African Americans have been more successful in advancing economically than previously believed. blacks did make real strides up the income distribution. But as they were working their way up the income distribution, the distribution itself was collapsing around them. This meant that they were denied the economic rewards that previous groups of Americans received upon mass entry into the middle class. Their upward relative mobility has amounted to a rearguard action that merely prevented the exacerbation of an already large racial income gap. Moving forward, today's high levels of income inequality further encumber the difficult struggle for racial and economic equality. Because the income distribution has become so unequal, each hard-won increase in relative status outside the very top now translates into a smaller absolute rise in income. End quote. Even as black Americans made inroads into the middle and upper middle class, their gains were squashed by enormous levels of general income inequality. This shows that capitalist forces have more of an impact than the omnipresent white supremacy that contemporary race reductionists want to believe. Calling this evidence of white supremacy and systemic racism is like putting a square peg into a round hole. It simply doesn't fit actual reality. Even criminal justice issues like mass incarceration can be difficult to analyze or solve if we apply the white supremacy/white racism framework. It is well known that the United States has the highest incarceration rate and largest incarcerated population in the world. Disparities among those incarcerated are quite stark, with black Americans making up 40% of the correctional population but only 13% of the US population. Whites, on the other hand, make up 64% of the US population but only 39% of the correctional population. The current discourse of anti-racism is chiefly concerned with addressing racial disparity among the incarcerated. Even if we were to eliminate these differences by making each group proportional to the makeup of the US population, America would still have the highest number of people incarcerated in the world. The same logic can be applied to police killings, where blacks are disproportionately among the victims, but nowhere near the majority. This isn't to downplay the seriousness of the number of black Americans killed by police, or the suffering of families who have lost loved ones to police violence, but to frame the issue as omnipotent white supremacy misses the fact that whites actually make up the majority of victims killed by police. If liberal anti-racists say the problem is the disparity between who is killed, then the only logical solution is to kill less people of color and kill more whites, which is clearly an absurd answer. Even if we distribute police killings proportionally to the racial makeup of the US population, we would still be losing around 1,000 people to police killings every year, which is extremely high. Now, calling the attacks suffered by Asians white supremacy masks the true class realities of the criminal justice system. The standard story on mass incarceration espoused by Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow and other liberals describes mass incarceration as a policy and strategy wielded by Southern whites as part of an Empire Strikes Back moment. Southern whites and politicians were motivated by racism and were fearful of the gains made by blacks in the civil rights movement, hence their utilization of carceral policy to defend the white racial order. Now, Professors Adonir Usmani and John Clegg dispel these misconceptions around crime and mass incarceration and instead center their critique on the unique changes in American society in the 20th century and the underdevelopment of the welfare state to redress social ailments. Contrary to popular belief, the American carceral system is shaped much more by class disparity between rich and poor rather than racial disparity. While it is true that blacks are disproportionately among those incarcerated, a white college dropout is 15 times more likely to be in prison than a black college graduate. Moreover, the incarceration rate of those with less than a high school degree skyrocketed over the last several decades, while the incarceration rate for college graduates, black and white, declined. As Professors Toure Reed, Adonir Usmani, and John Clegg note, crime is mainly a class issue. The combination of joblessness, loss of formal and informal forms of social control, inequality, and economic depravity brought forth by structural issues like automation, migration, and declining tax bases contributed to the rise of crime in the second half of the 20th century. In a similar analysis, Professor of Political Science Cedric Johnson traces the roots of the carceral state to the reorganization of American cities, economic recession, structural unemployment, and the rollback of the welfare state. Even as whites and some blacks made inroads into the middle class in the post-World War II boom, The slowdown of the economy in the 70s, along with creeping neoliberalism, created a hyper-ghettoized population that continues to be hyper-policed. Professor Johnson states, quote, "Contemporary patterns of incarceration and police violence are classed in a manner that is not restricted to blacks and whose central dynamics cannot be explained through institutional racism." End quote. A commonly held belief is that the American criminal justice system was built specifically to target black Americans. While it is true that blacks disproportionately feel the brunt of the justice system, only a specific subset of the population, such as the homeless, mentally ill, unemployed, and poor, are targeted by police and the justice system. By shifting our focus from racism/white supremacy as drivers of crime in the carceral state to policing surplus population as a function of class power and neoliberal hegemony, we're better equipped to analyze the forces that breed crime, policing, and incarceration. Rather than all-powerful white supremacy, academics like Toure Reed, Johnson, and Usmani clarify our understanding of criminal justice issues by grounding it in history, economics, and politics. Thinking about crime and incarceration as mainly affecting the most vulnerable and marginalized people allows us to situate them within capitalist social relations and the forces that reproduce this population. Stephen Jenkins, who is suspected of attacking Zhao Zhenji, had been homeless for 10 years and was treated for mental health issues in the past. Another high-profile incident occurred in Oakland, where a 75-year-old Asian man was robbed and killed when the suspects shoved him to the ground. The suspect has a long criminal history with arrests for burglary, assault, and robbery, including violently attacking two Asians in an attempted robbery. In another Oakland incident, the suspect, Yahya Muslim, violently shoved a 91-year-old man to the ground in the city's Chinatown neighborhood. The suspect was described as having severe mental illness, being homeless, and unemployed. In New York, the suspect, Brandon Elliott, violently attacked an older Asian woman near Times Square. He was on parole at the time and had been living at a homeless shelter. Patrick Thompson is accused of stabbing an elderly Asian woman in San Francisco's busy Market Street. He was previously sent to Napa State Hospital and was part of a mental health diversion program. These examples are not intended to promote tough-on-crime measures, nor are they reasons to minimize the culprit's responsibility. What they did was terrible, and I hope they are prosecuted. The victims will likely face a lifetime of trauma or physical ailments as a result of these vicious attacks. What should be clear from these examples is that the perpetrators come from the most submerged segments of our class society. Sociologist Loic Wacquant's studies on mass incarceration found that the profiles of welfare recipients and inmates were very similar. Many live in poverty, have mental or physical disabilities that prevent them from being gainfully employed, did not finish high school, and have bleak chances of success. This isn't to say we should abide by Republican or conservative Big D Democratic views that welfare encourages criminality. Quite the opposite. Crime control is inextricably linked to economic and social policies, state intervention in labor markets, fighting poverty, job creation, decommodification of healthcare and housing, and so on. This requires not only massive downward redistribution from top to bottom, but most importantly, the construction of a political movement capable of extracting concessions from elites. That road is currently blocked. Contemporary political discourse is dominated by the notion that diversity, anti-racism, and disparity are the only meaningful forms of social justice. This means white supremacy, rather than public policy, shape how we analyze and tackle social ills. This has produced the most repulsive and toothless solutions to our present crisis. Shopping at Asian-run businesses, attending diversity training, or having more Asian CEOs will not defeat the conditions that breed crime, nor will it protect our family members from victimization. These remedies do not shed light on how our economic processes drive the conditions that produce a class of marginalized, poverty-stricken, and vulnerable people that will certainly be entangled with the criminal justice system. These processes are not driven by a mystical white racism, but by real human beings of every color, sex, religion, and gender. This is a reality many Asian American activists do not or are unwilling to recognize. Addressing crime and crimes against Asians requires the development of a working class movement centered around the public interest. If we understand crime, criminal justice, and class to be linked, then our goal is to build the oppositional forces capable of challenging the subjugators. It cannot be built by a hashtag. It cannot be built by sharing pictures of Yuri Kochiyama. It cannot be built by ordering takeout from your favorite Chinese restaurant. It involves the difficult yet necessary work of talking to ordinary people, including friends, family, and coworkers, about a public goods focused agenda. The safety of our loved ones depends on it.